Partnerships are a key principle of the Sustainable Development Goals, both as one of the principles that's specified in the preamble and also mentioned very specifically in SDG 17 as a key means of implementation. And just yesterday, Helen Clark, in the UNDP 50th anniversary celebrations, both started and ended her opening speech with reference to partnerships as a critical piece in the development puzzle, particularly in addressing the complexity of the development challenges that we are facing. And those challenges in order to achieve this particular outcome of the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Global Agenda. However, in most discourses and as I will discuss later, practices of partnership, a consideration of power is largely absent. And the key takeaway from this talk today is that unless we take power seriously inside partnerships, those partnerships that we set up cannot live up to the promise that they attempt to deliver on. So, diving straight into it. Traditionally, when we think about how we're going to do development, what has happened is we've talked about states, represented by the billiard balls there on the left-hand side of the screen, different sizes of states, richer states, poorer states, weaker states, stronger states, organized into these very formal organizations, international organizations, whether part of the UN family or the UN system or other analogous organizations. And at the end of the last century, there was a growing realization that yes, these formal organizations are critical when it comes to achieving development. There are also informal webs and networks of relationships that make a difference. And in the first 10 years, towards the 2005 to 2010, there was a greater realization and an emerging body of work around thinking about these global networks as structures that would actually either enable or constrain actors' behaviors within them. And this presentation is taking a network approach to investigating and understanding partnerships in order to see what it is that partnerships, that this might bring to the study and understanding and practices of partnership. So, as I said, at the turn of the century, there was a great deal of attention being paid to the ways in which the formal hierarchy that exists might be contrasted with networked forms of organization. And there's an awful lot of literature that says the way that development and other social functioning works is either through markets or through hierarchy or through networks. And so on the left-hand side, you have the sort of traditional conceptualization of the formal organization with these black lines demonstrating that there is a hierarchy. There's somebody at the top, there's people in the middle, and then there are more individuals at the bottom. And if we then look at the green lines on the right-hand side of this diagram, what they're saying there is actually inside the organization, whatever the formal relationships between the actors inside that organization, there are also these informal relationships. And these informal relationships can usefully be studied in order to understand more about what's happening. And the idea about these networks usually is seen to be a very positive and optimistic view. So networks are seen as agile, they're seen as diverse, they're seen as inclusive, they're seen as being very, very, very much the same kinds of words that people would use to describe partnerships. And so I said, well, let's see if we take a networked approach to investigating partnerships, what that can tell us. And particularly if you follow the green lines outside the formal organizational structure that's in the middle there, partnerships are about individuals working in specific organizations and in specific sectors, working in collaboration with other individuals who don't work inside the same hierarchy that they do. They will work in different hierarchies, they work in different organizations, they work in different sectors. And so fundamentally, there is not a direct analogy between partnership and networks, but certainly something that says we could use this usefully to investigate partnerships. And one of the key aspects of networks in this way of thinking about networks is that if we say we have a network, if we say we have a partnership, then power disappears. And this is something that you'll find in academic literature in international relations, you will find it in policy discourses, and you will find some practitioners working with this assumption that networks reduce power, and so do partnerships, or at the very most they might reflect the power that we see in the outside world. Network theory has a different take on this. Network theory says actually networks could potentially reinforce power and deepen inequalities. So my question is, which of these could be seen through the case study that I investigated? So, as I said, the case study that I'm reporting on was a network study investigating a sector-specific global partnership. I'm very happy to go into the methodological details in the questions. I'm not sure that anybody particularly wants me to go into it right now. The important aspect here is just to say that what I did with the study was to say there is a formal documented partnership, and that formal documented partnership says these people should be included, these people should be involved, these people should have equal participation and access to all of the others. And I said, if I go and interview people and I ask them what they do, will the informal network that they report back to me in interview be similar or different to that formal partnership which has been documented on paper? And now I'll tell you what they told me. So, first of all, just a very quick word about partnership specifically. There are many different ways to approach partnership, from moral philosophy through to pragmatism and everything in between. My particular take on partnership, where I come to partnership from, was from aid relations. And fundamentally, what happened in aid relations was there was a traditional take on aid relations, which I call donorship, where fundamentally it was saying in order to achieve development, the donors need to tell recipients what it is that they should spend aid on. And the power relations were set up in a very specific way. The donors would tell the recipients what it was that they should spend their money on. In 2005, with the Paris Declaration, the OECD DAC donors said, we need to reverse this hierarchy. And what we need is for recipients to make their plans and to tell us, once they have taken ownership of their own development, to tell us what it is that they will spend the money on, and then donors will align behind that and pay for those development plans. Now, there's an awful lot of scholarship that argues that that didn't necessarily happen in practice, but that's the subject of another presentation. Today we're talking about partnership, which was the next phase in these aid relations, where instead of saying it's donors on top or it's the recipients, what the partnership principles are saying is actually it needs to be an equal playing field. We don't need hierarchy of relations. The relational structure that we need to set up needs to be egalitarian, and we also need to include traditionally excluded actors, specifically the civil society and the private sector, because previously in the formal organizations, global development policy and aid relations had been very much about states. It's not to say that civil society and the private sector weren't working in the same space, but they weren't included in this particular way. And then, as we saw at the beginning, the partnership was then included as a very, very, very specifically important principle, both for the achievement of the SDGs and also specifically the means of implementation, which takes the SDGs also from the global level into national implementation too. Okay, so this particular organization, going now into the details of the findings of this study. So the formal documented partnership included donors, recipients, multilateral agencies, civil society, and private sector foundations in different proportions, as you can see here. And the reasons for that are There are more states at the table because there is the democratic legitimacy that they have. They are the key implementers. All of these reasons. But equally, underneath the surface, it's still interesting to look at who is involved in these partnerships from the different sectors. So recipient countries, for example, are represented in this partnership by ministers, by politicians. Donor countries are represented by very senior civil servants whose expertise is in aid effectiveness, the majority of them economists. So the type of conversations that these different actors are used to having or more comfortable having, or priorities that they may have, would be very different. So there's something about the actors inside the formal documented partnership where we could already be saying, what is it that's happening inside here that is enabling egalitarian participation or not? I took it a step further and I contrasted that with the membership of the informal network. And that comparison, as you can see here, most of the sectors are overrepresented in the informal network, particularly the private sector and research, which was not involved in the formal network at all, the formal partnership. Recipients were missing from the informal communication network. That means that in all of the interviews that I did, when I asked people, who for you are the important interlocutors that you would discuss global policy with, nobody said a recipient government, a member of a recipient government, a recipient civil servant at all. Now, what's important here is that this is not missing data. This is evidence of an exclusion. And I'm not saying it's a deliberate exclusion, I'm saying this is what was reported in interview, and this is how these things, this is, even in the knowledge of what I was researching, these were the answers that were given to me by my respondents. But if I say I'm taking a network approach, it's not necessarily enough just to look at who's involved in this, but also then how they relate to each other. And so networks here are defined as actors and the relations between them. And if we're talking about relations, well, what does that actually mean? And the relations here, these are some of the types of things that we would look for in a network approach. So first of all, the existence. If we take this down to a playground analogy, if I say that I'm your friend, then I am claiming the existence of a relationship there. If, however, I say that I'm your friend, but you don't say that you're my friend, then that shows a lack of reciprocity, which probably means that you're a more popular child than I am. And in terms of policy networks, what that probably is indicating is a difference of prestige between the person to whom I'm claiming the relationship, if they don't reciprocate with me, or of influence. Certainly, I'm probably more likely to want to influence that person than they would necessarily prioritize influencing me. So these are some of the things that we would look for when we're examining relations in a network approach. Okay, so lots and lots and lots of numbers here. Right, these are what's called adjacency matrices. And the way that they work is that if we look down the rows on the left-hand side, we've got donors, recipients, etc. And if we track along to the cell where you have donor to donor, what that means is that if I'm a donor and I say I have a relationship with another donor, that donor also says they have a relation with me. Equally, if I'm a donor and I say I have a relationship with a recipient, they also say they have a relationship with me. So this is perfect reciprocity. Research and political actors, those are on zeros because in the formal documented partnership, there weren't any people from those categories included, but they did come up in the informal network, so I did include them in the analysis. So you can see here, one is reciprocity. If in the informal network, which I'll show you in a moment, you have numbers that are greater than one, that would show that that sector is being privileged. If the number is less than one, it shows that it's in a subordinate position. And this is what came out from the informal network. So you can see that they don't match. There is not equal reciprocity. We don't see ones across the board. And we can see where the numbers are greater than 1. For example, if you go down to the multilateral, the M, where it says 3.44. So multilateral agencies were much more likely to claim relationships with donors than donors were to reciprocate. If we look at the civil society line, CS, there again, civil society was much more likely to claim relations with donor states than were reciprocated, and even more likely to claim relations with multilateral agencies, which were even less likely to be reciprocated. So there's something about saying, yes, it's about who is involved in the partnership, but it's also about understanding the way the relationships work among those actors. Enough numbers. This is now something which is more likely to show the extent of the disparities. So the floor is set on 1 because the perfect reciprocity ratio would be 1. And you can see that donors and multilateral agencies are overrepresented, so to speak. Recipients, civil society, private sector, underrepresented. Each one a little less than the one before. If we go under the surface a little bit more, the multilateral agencies here, donor multilateral agencies are much, much more overrepresented than implementing agencies. So there's something here about donors and the policy influence that they are seen to have, that the relationships that are claimed to them are much, much, much greater. So I've shown you that it's different, and I've shown you that it's different in different ways for different sectors. But the question still remains, does it matter? Is it significantly different? Now, you can't run conventional statistical analyses on network variables because there is no normal curve for networks. What you can do is compare one network with another and say, do these two network structures, are they significantly correlated with each other? So I run that analysis, which is the multiple regression quadratic assignment procedure. And what that basically all of these numbers, what they tell us is that there is no significant correlation between the formal partnership and the informal network, which means that they are significantly different to each other. So it matters. It's not just a case of saying they're different and it matters. Okay, moving on now to another very useful tool in network analysis, which is actually, it allows us to simultaneously consider a multitude of relationships at the same time. So it's not just about saying it's a relationship between me and you or her and him. It's actually saying we can put all of those relationships together and see what the social structure is of this network. This would be a perfectly egalitarian network. All of the nodes are equally connected to each other, and all of the nodes can reach each other node in the network without having to go through any other node. So this would be an ideal partnership. And when I looked at the informal partnership to compare it, again, it's a very, very different structure. And as we saw from the analysis before, it's a statistically significantly different structure. To go into this in a bit more detail, there's a core and periphery structure in this network. Inside the core, we have the donors and the multilateral, so actors, individuals from donor states and multilateral agencies. And again, more from multilateral donors than from implementing agencies. On the left-hand side, we have some orange nodes, which are the civil society actors, and the light blue are private sector actors. And there's green researchers in there as well. And what's interesting here is there's almost a movement from left to right, where you have the civil society actors claiming relationships into the core of the donor states and multilaterals, and then those donor states and multilaterals claiming relationships out to the private sector, as well as having some of those reciprocated. And what the different sizes of the nodes are it says there it's sized by in degree. And what that means is if the node has more individuals claiming relationships to that node, the size of the node is greater than if they have fewer. So very different network structures and significantly different network structures too. So coming back to the initial question about partnerships and power then, it would seem from this case study that what we're looking at is network theory is being proved right, in that this network appears to be reinforcing the power that we know exists outside the network among from existing aid relations. And so how can network theory help us to explain that difference? If it's making a claim that networks reinforce power, how does it help us to explain that? And it helps us to explain that through talking about tie formation, which is basically who do you choose to initiate or maintain a relationship with. And this article that I'm quoting here has been quoted in over 1,000 other papers from disciplines from physics through to sociology and everything in between. And basically the theory says networks grow by including new individuals inside the network. So in this case with partnership, we're including civil society actors, we're including private sector. But it says that these new nodes, these new people, will preferentially make relationships with nodes that are already well connected. That is, nodes that are already in the core. And that makes a difference. And that is why networks are much, much, much more likely to reinforce power relationships than they are to reduce them, which is what the discourse of partnerships would have us believe. And so tie formation is motivated by these preferential ties that who we choose to initiate a relationship with makes a difference to how power, relative power, is distributed inside the network. And also homophily and proximity. Now these are big words for birds of a feather flock together. Basically it means that if a donor joins the network, they're much more likely to initiate and maintain a relationship with another donor who's already inside this partnership than they are civil society, for example. And it doesn't necessarily only have to be, oh, I wear the badge of a donor state. It can also be other actors who fulfill a similar function. And the private sector in this particular partnership is very much seen as fulfilling a donor function, in that it is constructed as being an important partner for filling the funding gap. So very important here to say that network theory is actually predicting that networks will, and partnerships that work in a networked fashion, will reinforce power inequalities, and explains it through preferential ties and homophily as well. So a few words to summarize here. The design, these ideal partnership structures that we have been talking about are not, in this particular case, the same as the practices that have been reported by individuals. I'm reporting on one particular case. More case study evidence is obviously required. But in this particular case, it's very, very clear. And in conclusion here, these partnership principles and virtues may well exist on paper, but the practices require empirical investigation, because in this particular case, and in other cases that you may have personal experience of, relative power is bestowed unequally outside the network and continues inside the network, inside the partnerships. And partnerships could well deliver on the promise that they have to give us innovative solutions to intractable development problems. How they're actually implemented, what happens in practice, is a key factor that will decide whether they can do that or not, and whether the 2030 agenda will be fulfilled. Network tools I would definitely say that these network tools could contribute to the methodological toolbox that we have to investigate and understand partnerships better. And I would say that for both academic research and also operational research. I've applied these tools in both spheres and in both cases very successfully, because they bring clarity of concepts and also of measurements. It's not a question of saying, well, it feels more powerful or it feels less powerful. These are methods that can explain why these power relations are reinforced, and also allow you to measure them. Network theory does have a limitation, obviously. A lot of network theory argues that actors' effectiveness is determined by their social structure, by their position within the network. I would argue that it's not so much that actors' behavior and effectiveness is determined by it, it's certainly shaped by it, it's certainly influenced. But I do think that actors inside of networks have agency, that they can choose to act and behave differently. Which brings it on to the third point. There's a lot of work around saying reframing is what we need. If we say the word partnership often enough, then it will happen, and it'll happen well, and it will deliver these innovative solutions. I'm not sure that that's the case. I think that it's necessary, but I don't think that it's sufficient. And network rewiring is actually also going to help us get from where we are now to actually implementing partnerships in a partnership way. And that action required means that you can plot a route from being in a partnership or setting up partnerships that are reinforcing existing power inequalities to actually reducing them. And when it comes to taking action to improve what's happening in terms of partnership, there is a lot of work that says that what is required is a politics of resistance from less powerful actors in these partnerships or in aid relations. I'm not saying that that's not necessary. I do think it's one part of the puzzle. What network analysis tells us is, in fact, you also need to have the more powerful members of these networks rewiring their relationships so they are including these less powerful actors in a meaningful and participatory way. And that is actually the challenge. If partnerships are to live up to the principles, then these power differentials must be taken seriously by people inside of partnerships, by people who are setting up partnerships, and also by people who are investigating and researching these partnerships. And what that means is that if donors, both state and multilateral donors and private sector actors, are to defend themselves against accusations of perpetuating inequalities of power or profiteering, then these more powerful actors must be seen to rewire their networks in order for partnership to deliver. And the last point there about systems approaches. It's critical to take a systems approach. This study focused on the relationships and the interactions inside partnerships and how they would be generating different feedbacks. Also, other areas that need to be taken into account are non-linear change. There is the assumption that if we do this, then the next thing will happen and the next thing will happen. Not necessarily. And sometimes you can do a series of very small actions and you get no response. You do a series of very small actions and you reach a tipping point and you get a huge response. You can't necessarily predict that, which means that you then need to be thinking about how you actually have an embedded, systematic, participatory systems evaluation inside of partnerships to be able to track the relationships, the feedbacks, the interactions, and also the emergent properties. What we have with a partnership agenda is the imposition of a new set of relationships and practices on an existing set of relationship and practices. And those things, it's not going to change overnight, but we need to track how it is changing as they go along in order to make smaller course corrections through the life course of a partnership in order to ensure that taking a small course correction early will actually be much more likely to lead to the outcome that is desired. So, finally, partnerships do have the potential to be inclusive, egalitarian, and participatory. However, I would argue if they're assumed to fulfill this potential, rather than us taking power seriously and taking specific actions that will ensure that they can fulfill this potential, then partnerships can't serve as a useful means of implementation of the 2030 global agenda, and nor can they in practice live up to the principles put forward in the SDGs. Thank you.